Chapter 4.
When Augustus left Call sitting on the steps, he took a slow stroll through the wagon yard and down the street, stopping for a moment on the sandy bottom of Hat Creek to strap on his pistol. The night was quiet as sleep. No night when he expected to have to shoot anybody, but it was only wise to have the pistol handy in case he had to whack a drunk. It was an old Colt Dragoon with a 7-inch barrel, and he was fond of saying, weighed about as much as the leg he strapped it to. One whack would usually satisfy most drunks, and 2 whacks would drop an ox if Augustus cared to put his weight into it. The border knights had qualities that he had come to admire, different as they were from the qualities of knights in Tennessee. In Tennessee, as he remembered, nights tended to be mushy, with a cottony mist drifting into the hollows. Border nights were so dry you could smell the dirt, and clear as dew. In fact, the nights were so clear it was tricky. Even with hardly any moon, the stars were bright enough that every bush and fence post cast a shadow. P.I., who had a jumpy disposition, was always shying from shadows, and he had even blazed away at innocent chaparral bushes on occasion, mistaking them for bandits. Augustus was not particularly nervous, but even so, he had hardly started down the street before he got a scare. A little ball of shadow ran right at his feet. He jumped sideways, fearing snake bite. Although his brain knew snakes didn't roll like balls, then he saw an armadillo hustle past his feet. Once he saw what it was, he tried to give it a kick to teach it not to walk in the street scaring people. But the armadillo hurried right along as if it had as much right to the street as a banker. The town was not roaring with people, nor was it bright with light, though a light was on at the Pumphreys, whose daughter was about to have a baby. The Pumphreys ran a store. The baby their daughter was expecting would arrive in the world to find itself fatherless, since the boy who had married the Pumphrey girl had drowned in the Republican River in the fall of the year, with the girl only just pregnant. There was only one horse hitched outside the drive-bean when Augustus strolled up, a rangy sorrel that he recognized as belonging to a cowboy named Dishwater Bogat. So named because he had once rushed into camp so thirsty from a dry drive that he wouldn't wait his turn at the water barrel, and he had filled up on some dishwater the cook had been about to throw out. Seeing the sorrel gave Augustus a prime feeling because Dish Bogat loved card playing, though he lacked even minimal skills. Of course, he also probably lacked ante-money, but that didn't necessarily rule out a game. Dish was a good hand and could always get hired. Augustus didn't mind playing for futures with such a man. When he stepped in the door, everybody was looking peeved, probably because Lippy was banging away at My Bonnie Lies Over the Ocean, a song that he loved to excess and played as if he hoped it could be heard in the capital of Mexico. Xavier Wantz, the little Frenchman who owned the place, was nervously wiping his tables with a wet rag. Xavier seemed to think keeping the tables well wiped was the crucial factor in this business, though Augustus was often forced to point out to him that such a view was nonsense. Most of the patrons of the drive-bean were so lacking in fastidiousness that they wouldn't have noticed a dead skunk on the tables, much less a few crumbs and spilled drinks. Xavier himself had a near monopoly on fastidiousness in Lonesome Dove. He wore a white shirt the year round, clipped his little mustache once a week, and even wore a bow tie, or at least a black shoestring that did its best to serve as a bow tie. Some cowpoke could swipe Xavier's last real bow tie, probably meaning to try and impress some girl somewhere up the trail. Since the shoestring was limp and not stiff like a bow tie should be, it merely added to the melancholy of Xavier's appearance, which would have been melancholy enough without it. He had been born in New Orleans and had ended up in Lonesome Dove because someone had convinced him Texas was the land of opportunity. Though he soon discovered otherwise, he was too proud or too fatalistic to attempt to correct his mistake. He approached day-to-day life in the drive-bean with a resigned temper, which on occasion stopped being resigned and became explosive. And when it exploded, the placid air was apt to be rent by Creole curses. "Good evening, my good friend," Augustus said. He said it with as much gravity as he could muster, since Xavier appreciated a certain formality. It was hard to extend the amenities when Lippy was at the height of a performance. Dish Bogat was sitting at one of the tables with Lorena, hoping to persuade her and give him a poke on credit. Though Dish was barely 22, he wore a walrus mustache that made him look years older than he was, and much more solemn. In color, the mustache was stuck between yellow and brown, kind of prairie dog colored, Augustus thought. He frequently suggested to Dish that if he wanted to eat prairie dog, he ought to remember to pick his teeth, a reference to the mustache whose subtlety was lost on Dish. Lorena had her usual look, the look of a woman who was somewhere else. She had a fine head of blonde hair, whose softness alone set her apart in a country where most women's hair had a consistency not much softer than saddle strings. Her cheeks hollowed a little, gave her a distracting beauty. Augustus's experience had taught him that hollow-cheeked beauty was a dangerous kind. His two wives had both been fat-cheeked and trustworthy, but had possessed little resistance to the climate. One had expired of pleurisy in only the second year of their marriage, while the other had been carried off by scarlet fever after the seventh. But the woman Lorena put him most in mind of was Clara Allen, whom he had loved hardest and deepest, and still loved. Clara's eyes were direct and sparkled with interest, whereas Lorena's were always side-looking. Still, there was something about the girl that reminded him of Clara, who had chosen a stolid horse rancher when she decided to marry. "I got Dish," he said, going over to the table. "I never expected to see you loafing down here in the South this time of year." "Loan me $2, Gus," Dish said. "Not me. Why would I loan money to a loafer? You ought to be trailing cattle by this time of year." "Well, I'll be leaving next week to do just that," Dish said. "Loan me $2 and I'll pay you in the fall." "Unless you get drowned or stomped or shoot somebody and get hung," Augustus said. "No, sir. Too many perils ahead. Anyway, I've known you to be sly, Dish. You probably got $2 and just don't want to spend it." Lippy finished his concert and came and joined them. He wore a brown bowler hat that he had picked up on the road to San Antonio some years before. Either it had blown out of a stagecoach, or the Indians had snatched some careless drummer and not bothered to take his hat. At least those were the two theories Lippy had worked out in order to explain his good fortune in finding the hat. In Augustus's view, the hat would have looked better blowing around the country for 2 years than it did at the present. Lippy only wore it when he played the piano. When he was just gambling or sitting around attending to the leak from his stomach, he frequently used the hat for an ashtray and then sometimes forgot to empty the ashes before putting the hat back on his head. He only had a few strips of stringy gray hair hanging off the skull, and the ashes didn't make them look much worse. But ashes represented only a fraction of the abuse the bowler had suffered. It was also Lippy's pillow, and had had so many things spilled on it or in it that Augustus could hardly look at it without gagging. "That hat looks about like a buffalo cud. The hat ain't meant to be a chamber pot, you know. If I was you, I'd just throw it away." Lippy was so named because his lower lip was about the size of the flap on a saddlebag. He could tuck enough snuff under it to last a normal person at least a month. In general, the lip lived a life of its own there toward the bottom of his face. Even when he was just sitting quietly, studying his cards, the lip waved and wiggled as if it had a breeze blowing across it, which in fact it did. Lippy had something wrong with his nose and breathed with his mouth wide open. Accustomed as she was to hard doings, it still had taken Lorena a while to get used to the way Lippy slurped when he was eating. And she had once had a dream in which a cowboy walked by Lippy and buttoned the lip to his nose as if it were a flap of a pocket. But her disgust was nothing compared to Xavier's, who suddenly stopped wiping tables and came over and grabbed Lippy's hat off his head. Xavier was in a bad mood, and his features quivered like those of a trapped rabbit. "Disgrace! I won't have this hat." "Who can eat?" Xavier said, though nobody was trying to eat. He took the hat around the bar and flung it out the back door. Once as a boy, he had carried slops in a restaurant in New Orleans that actually used tablecloths, a standard of excellence which haunted him still. Every time he looked at the bare tables and the dry bean, he felt a failure. Instead of having tablecloths, the tables were so rough you could get a splinter just running your hand over them. Also, they weren't attractively round. Since the cowboys could not be prevented from whittling on their edges, over the years, sizable chunks had been whittled off, giving most of the tables an unbalanced look. He himself had a linen tablecloth, which he brought out once a year on the anniversary of the death of his wife. His wife had been a bully, and he didn't miss her, but it was the only occasion sufficient to provide an excuse for the use of a tablecloth in Lonesome Dove. His wife, whose name had been Teresa, had bullied horses, too, which is why his team had run off and flung themselves and the buggy into a gully, the buggy landing right on top of Teresa. At the annual dinner in her honor, Xavier proved that he was still a restaurateur of discipline by getting drunk without spilling a drop on the fine tablecloth. Augustus was the only one invited to the dinners, but he only came every 3 or 4 years out of politeness. Not only were the occasions mournful and silly, everyone in Lonesome Dove had been glad to see the last of Teresa. They were mildly dangerous. Augustus was neither as disciplined a drinker as Xavier, nor as particular about tablecloths, and he knew that if he spilled liquor on the precious linen, the situation would end badly. He would not likely have to shoot Xavier, but it might be necessary to whack him on the head, and Augustus hated to hit such a small head with such a large pistol. To Xavier, Lippy's hat was the final exacerbation. No man of dignity would allow such a hat in his establishment, much less on the head of an employee. So from time to time, he seized it and flung it out the door. Perhaps a goat would eat it. They were said to eat worse. But the goats ignored the hat. Lippy always went out to retrieve it when he remembered he needed an ashtray. "Disgrace," Xavier said again, in a somewhat happier tone. Lippy was unperturbed. "Well, what's wrong with the hat? It was made in Philadelphia. So it says inside it." It said so, but Augustus, not Lippy, was the one who had originally made the point. Lippy could not have read a word as big as Philadelphia, and he had only the vaguest notion of where the city was. All he knew was that it must be a safe and civilized place if they had time to make hats instead of fighting Comanches. "Xavier, I'll make you a deal," Augustus said. "You loan Dish $2 so we can get a little game going, and I'll rake that hat into a tow sack and carry it home to my pigs. It's the only way you'll ever get rid of it. If you wear it again, I will burn it," Xavier said, still inflamed. "I will burn the whole place." "Then where will you go?" "Well, if you was to burn that piano, you best have a swift mule waiting," Lippy said, his lip undulating as he spoke. "Church folks won't like it." Dish found the conversation a burden to listen to. He had delivered a small horse herd in Matamoros and had ridden nearly 100 miles upriver with Lori in mind. It was funny he would do it, since the thought of her scared him, but he had just kept riding, and here he was. He mainly did his sporting with Mexican hordes, but now and then he found he wanted a change from small brown women. Lorena was so much of a change that at the thought of her his throat clogged up and he lost his ability to talk. He had already been with her 4 times and had a vivid memory of how white she was, moon pale and touched with shadows, like the night outside. Only not like the night, exactly. He could ride through the night peacefully, and a ride with Lorena was not peaceful. She used some cheap powder, a souvenir of her city living, and the smell of it seemed to follow Dish for weeks. He didn't like just paying her, though. It seemed to him it would be better if he brought her a fine present from Abilene or Dodge. He could get away with that with the senoritas. They liked the idea of presents to look forward to, and Dish was careful never to renege. He always came back from Dodge with ribbons and combs. But somehow he could not get up the nerve to even make the suggestion to Lorena. It was hard enough to make a plain business offer. Often she seemed not to hear questions when they were put to her. It was hard to make a girl realize you had special feelings for her when she wouldn't look at you, didn't hear you, and made your throat clog up. It was even harder to live with the thought that the girl in question didn't want you to have the special feelings, particularly if you were about to go up the trail and not see her for many months. Confusing as these feelings were, they were made even worse for Dish by the realization that he couldn't afford even the transaction that the girl would accept. He was down to his last 2 bits, having lost a full month's wages in a game in Matamoros. He had no money, had no eloquence with which to persuade Lorena to trust him, but he did have a dogged persistence that was prepared to sit in the dry bean all night and hope that his evident need would finally move her. Under the circumstances, it was a sore trial to Dish that Augustus had come in. It seemed to him that Lori had been getting a little friendlier, and if nothing had happened to distract her, he might soon have prevailed. At least it had been just him and her at the table, which had been nice in itself. But now it was him and her and Augustus and Lippy, making it difficult, if not impossible, for him to plead his case. Though all he had really been doing by the way of pleading was to look at her frequently with big, hopeful eyes. Lippy began to feel unhappy about the fact that Xavier had thrown his hat out the door. Augustus's mention of the pigs put the whole matter in a more ominous light. After all, the pigs might come along and eat the hat, which was one of the solidest comforts in his meager existence. He would have liked to go out and retrieve the hat before the pigs came along, but he knew that it wasn't really wise to provoke Xavier unduly when he was in a bad mood anyway. He couldn't see out the back door because the bar was in the way. For all he knew, the hat might already be gone. "I wished I could get back to St. Louis," he said. "I hear it's a right busy town." He had been reared there, and when his heart was heavy, he returned to it in his thoughts. "Why, hell, go. Life's a short affair. Why spend it here?" "Well, you are," Dish said in a surly tone, hoping Gus would take the hint and set out immediately. "Dish, you sound like you've got a sour stomach," Augustus said. "What you need is a good, satisfying game of cards." "Nothing of the kind," Dish said, casting a bold and solicitous glance at Lorena. Looking at her was like looking at the hills. The hills stayed as they were. You could go to them if you had the means, but they extended no greeting. Xavier stood at the door, staring into the dark. The rag he used to wipe the tables was dripping onto his pants leg, but he didn't notice. "It's too bad nobody in town ain't dead," Augustus remarked. "This group has the makings of a first-rate funeral party. What about you, Wance? Let's play cards." Xavier acquiesced. It was better than nothing. Besides, he was a devilish good card player, one of the few around who was a consistent match for Augustus. Lorena was competent. Tankersley had taught her a little. When the dry bean was full of cowboys, she was not allowed to sit in, but on nights when the clientele consisted of Augustus, she often played. When she played, she changed, particularly if she won a little. Augustus frequently did his best to help her win a little, just to see the process take place. The child in her was briefly reborn. She didn't chatter, but she did occasionally laugh out loud, and her cloudy eyes cleared and became animated. Once in a while, when she won a really good pot, she would give Augustus a little punch with her fist. It pleased him when that happened. It was good to see the girl enjoying herself. It put him in the mind of family games, the kind he had once played with his lively sisters in Tennessee. The memory of those games usually put him to drinking more than he'd like to, and all because Lori ceased being a sulky whore for a little while and reminded him of happy girls he had once known. They played until the rustler's moon had crossed to the other side of town. Lorena brightened so much that Dish Bogat fell worse in love with her than ever. She filled him with such an ache that he didn't mind Xavier won half of his next month's wages. The ache was very much with him when he finally decided there was no hope and stepped out into the moonlight to unhitch his horse. Augustus had come with him, while Lippy sneaked out the back door to retrieve his hat. The light in Lorena's room came on while they were standing there, and Dish looked up at it, catching her shadow as she passed in front of the lamp. "Well, Dish, so you're leaving us. Which outfit's lucky enough to have you this trip?" The quick glimpse of Lorena put Dish in such perplexity of spirit that he could hardly focus on the question. Reckon I'm going up with the W's, he said, his eyes still on the window. The cause of Dish's melancholy was not lost on Augustus. Well, that's Shanghai Pierce's bunch, he said. Yep, Dish said, starting to lift his foot into the stirrup. Now, hold on a minute, Dish, Augustus said. He fished in his pocket and came out with $2, which he handed to the surprised cowboy. If you're riding north with old Shang, we may never meet again on this side of the burn, Augustus said, deliberately adopting a legion tone. At the very least, you'll get your hearing ruined. That voice of his could deafen a rock. Dish had to smile. Gus seemed unaware that one of the more persistent topics of dispute on the Texas range was whether his voice was louder than Shanghai Pierce's. It was commonly agreed that the two men had no close rivals when it came to being deafening. Why'd you give me this money? Dish asked. He had never been able to figure Gus out. You asked me for it, didn't you? If I'd have given it to you before the game started, I might as well have handed it to once. And he don't need no $2 of mine. There was a pause while Dish tried to puzzle out the real motive, if there was one. I'd not want it thought I'd refuse a simple loan to a friend, especially not one who's going off with Shanghai Pierce. Oh, Mr. Pierce don't go with us, Dish said. He goes over to New Orleans and takes the train. Augustus said nothing, and Dish soon concluded that he was to get the loan, even if the aggravation of Mr. Pierce's company wasn't involved. Well, much obliged then, Dish said. I'll see you in the fall, if not sooner. There's no need for you to ride off tonight. You could throw your blanket down on our porch if you like. I might do that, Dish said, feeling rather awkward. He rehitched his horse and went to the door of the drive-in, wanting to get upstairs before Lori turned off her light. I believe I left something, he said lamely at the door of the saloon. Well, I won't wait, Dish. We'll expect you for breakfast if you care to stay. As he strolled away, he heard the boy's footsteps hitting the stairs at the back of the saloon. Dish was a good boy, not much less green than Newt, though a more experienced hand. Best to help such boys have their moment of fun before life's torment snatched them. From a distance, standing in the pale street, he saw two shadows against the yellow box of light from Lori's room. She wasn't that set against Dish, it seemed to him, and she had been pepped up from all the card playing. Maybe even Lori would be surprised and find a liking for the boy. Occasionally, he had known sporting women to marry and do well at it. If Lori were so inclined, Dish Boguet would not be a bad man to settle on. The light had gone off at the Pumphrey's. Armadillo was no longer there to roll its shadow at him. Pigs were all stretched out on the porch, lying practically snout to snout. Augustus was about to kick them off to make room for the guest he more or less expected, but they looked so peaceful he relented and went around to the back door. If Dish Boguet, with his prairie dog of a mustache, considered himself too refined to throw his bedroll beside two fine pigs, then he could root him out himself.